everyone. Thank you very much for joining. I'm Karen Freeb. I'm a real estate partner in the London office of Bird & Bird. We're an international law firm, and I also lead the firm's hotels and hospitality group. So the focus for today's session is ESG, but in the context of hotel management agreements. And I just wanted to start by asking for a show of hands from the audience, please, as to how many of you are involved in hotel management agreements in any way in your everyday business. Reasonable, about a third, I would say, don't you think? More? Chris says more.
Wouldn't you
say leases as well, maybe?
Oh, no, this is all HMAs, so about a third to a half of people, that's good. So, and again, just to set the scene, for those of you who are not familiar with a hotel management agreement, this is a contract under which the owner of a hotel will appoint a brand or a manager to run the hotel, operate the hotel on its behalf, on behalf of the owner, in return for a fee. So in many ways, it is a pure sort of contract for the performance of services. And I think that's really important to remember in the context of the discussion we're about to have. So I'd now like to pass over for our distinguished panelists to introduce themselves. If I could ask to start with you, Hadrian, please.
Hello, everyone. My name is Hadrian, and I work for Kempinski Hotels. I'm general counsel, managing a small legal team, and I also lead the group sustainability committee.
Hi, my name is Asa. I'm Chief Development Officer of Cycas Hospitality. We're a hotel management company across Europe and UK. And we have a lot of things to talk about HMAs.
I'm Chris Evans. I'm a partner at Hamilton Hotel Partners. Actually, we're called Hamilton Pyramid now, and I keep forgetting that. But we are essentially a white label operator managing hotels and asset managing hotels on behalf of the capital.
I'm David Kellett, and I head up all alternative investments for Invesco, which covers hotels, the living space, all the stuff that goes with that, and also ESG across our whole business in Europe.
Thank you very much, everyone. Before we get into the Q&A, I would say that I hope we'll have about 5 to 10 minutes for questions from the floor at the end, so please do save up your questions. That's the bit we like the most. And before we get started on the questions, I'd also like to mention, as some of you will already know, that the EEA has recently launched in March, in fact, a survey with Questex, which invited respondents to share their views on ESG and hotel management contracts. So the survey's aim was really to ascertain the current state of play regarding ESG and HMAs and the appetite of the parties to those contracts for the inclusion of provisions or in those contracts. We're not able to share any results of that survey yet because it's still open, but we would ask you to look out for it, and please do your best to perhaps have a look at it and complete it after today. Ufi will, I think, again be sharing the link to it. So we want to make sure that if we do go live with it, that it will be a proper representative sample of people who are in the sector. So starting on our Q&A, are you currently seeing ESG clauses in management contracts? And if so, what do they cover? Is it all elements of ESG, or just the E and not the elusive S, for example? So this is something that I'd like to ask each of you to answer, please. Perhaps starting with Hadrian.
Yes, we have seen some ESG clauses in HMAs, quite limited, and I'll talk a little bit more about that later. But on Kempinski's side, our ESG clause focuses on CSR.
Yeah, we have. We also amended our HMAs a few years back now, and we have a on the S side, diversity and inclusion clause that we will keep it and not be challenged about, and of course the rest of the social responsibility.
Could you elaborate perhaps a little bit on that?
Yeah, so what we have added is that sort of in the template or boilerplate of our HMA is that we state that we will run the hotel within CICAS values, which is encompassing the equality, diversity, inclusion, and that this is a part of our management structure, and that cannot be removed, because over the years you do see quite different type of owners as we've grown into many, many countries. We're now in 12 countries and we have many different owners. And in the past, what we have realized that not everybody respects what we will assume normal today within the diversity and inclusion and fair pay and all that. So we felt the need that we need to include that, and we will never gonna remove that. And if the counterparty is not happy, then we're very happy to walk away, which, well, in the middle of the COVID, a new management contract we had, 3, in fact, we walked away just because that their values will not include that once we took over the hotels. And that was our statement, I think, to that particular owner, but to the market as well, that we have to stand by all parts of the ESG. But as a manager, of course, there's only so many things you can change. And social responsibility, I think, is our utmost importance as a managers, that we have to push that. So we're trying to work on that.
And that's interesting, because in the survey that I mentioned, we're seeing it coming through that it really is the expectation that managers will take the lead on things like CSR, for example. Chris, bearing in mind that you're, I would say, both an asset manager and an operator in some cases, what's your perspective?
Yeah,
what are you seeing?
I mean, we are increasingly operators rather than asset managers, although asset management is still a big part of our business. And I suppose one of the differences, as far as we're concerned, is that we work for a really wide variety of client types. So it could be private equity, it could be sovereign wealth funds. We work a lot with some of the landed estates, and you and I have a bit of experience together on that.
We do.
And also with institutional investors. And each one of those investor types have different requirements. So we don't have, I suppose this is a long way of saying, we don't have a template management agreement that we plop on the table at the beginning of discussions. We really have to tailor-make both the management agreement and the specific provisions to the requirements of the type of investor.
Specific asset, yes.
So I would say most of the management agreements or the requirements on the part of investors at the moment are relatively imprecise. I think it's something that's being introduced, and it's normally something along the lines of a requirement to operate the hotel in accordance with the owner's ESG policies and procedures. Now, that the lawyers in the room might say, you can't do that, that's way too open. But I think until we get some precision into these provisions, I think that's about as much as we can do.
It's definitely very early days in this debate, I think.
Unquestionably.
So, yeah. David?
To remember the question, but I think the answer was yes to the question.
What are you seeing in terms of obligations that the parties may be committing themselves to?
Look, I think we insist on it as an owner, and whether that's in a lease or in a management agreement, and some of the leases look a bit like management agreements, but every one of our hotel contracts has some form of, it would be called a green clause, right? Which then sort of says, well, what's that do? That deals with E. I think it's a big area, and we found discussing with some of the big brands, I distinctly remember this because it was during COP26 when they were holding it in Glasgow, and the brand came back and said, oh, well, we had a fight about having an ESG clause in a management agreement, and they wouldn't stick to it. And then they said to me, this is while this thing was going on in Glasgow, when all of us were watching it, and they said, oh, well, it only applies to you, so if you sell the hotel, that clause drops away. I said, sorry, this is, we're not in the 1990s. I mean, we're here looking forward. We've got everybody up on stage talking about how we change the business for the future. And so it is a huge, huge point. And it can come back to, you might have your CEO up on stage saying something, you can have your lawyers in the room saying something completely different. And so there actually needs to be, I think, a very big commitment from all of the players. It's great to hear what Ashley's saying about, bringing in some of the S side, D and E. This stuff if I look at what matters to our investors, clearly the first thing is returns, right? But after that, they're big institutions. So often big pension funds, their ESG requirements are immense. I mean, really, really are. And in terms of the investment we need to make into buildings, a whole load of that is to do with ESG. And to not have it in the operational agreement is, I think is wrong, actually. And
I think one of the issues, though, isn't it? Because a hotel management agreement is quite a long contract. In many ways, 15, sometimes 20 years, sometimes longer. Yeah. And I think at the moment, when the thinking is it's such a in its infancy like this, I think a lot of people are naturally cautious about how those provisions might evolve.
But the clause can be, as part of the annual budget process, we will agree an ESG strategy and plan for the next year, right? It doesn't have to be. That's
in fact the kind of provision that we're seeing, something just for the parties to talk to each other at budget time about what might happen.
It doesn't say what, they tend to be agreements to agree because, as you say, they're for a very, very long time and they have to be governed and all these things. But it's making sure it's coming up on the agenda and it's not just forgotten. Now, as a landlord, we've got a whole load more requirements, and there is then that question of how do those requirements compare with what is in the management agreement? And this is where you get the conflict, because there can be things in the management agreement or the brand standards that might conflict with the ESG direction of the landlord or the real estate owner.
I think that's definitely an issue, because as a landlord you'll be getting requirements placed upon you by, say, the planning authorities, from example, to maintain a green roof on a building or whatever, and you'll also be coming under pressure probably from your lenders.
The UK government said, what did they say? We want all commercial buildings to be B-rated EPC by 2030. They probably said that without thinking through what that actually meant from a feasibility standpoint. But governments can come out and say quite sweeping statements, particularly off the back of, you talk about climate targets, and we would always look at CREM and how we're doing against that model. And there's a load to do, right? So yeah.
There is a lot to do, and I think we can't get away from the fact that with a management contract, it all comes back to then the essence of this contract, which is causing a lot of the debate, which is that fundamentally the operator is running the building, running the operation on behalf of the owner in a relatively low margin business in return for a fee. And interestingly, some of the survey results that have been coming in so far are showing that most of our respondents to date have been owners. And very overwhelmingly, the feeling is that there should not be an obligation on owners to incur expenditure on ESG-related matters. So I think that's one of the difficulties we have here. I'd like to just pass directly on to Hadrian, and say, so as a representative of a major brand, Kempinski, could you perhaps share with us Kempinski's philosophy on ESG generally, and also in the context of HMAs? And do you believe that an HMA is a good place to cover these sort of issues?
Thank you. So Kempinski started its sustainability journey a long time ago, and has looked at it on various aspects, from the environmental, the social, and the governance. And we've always had a strong focus on valuing traditions and local communities. But it's never really been a big sort of PR exercise for us, although as ESG has evolved and standards have evolved, we too have evolved in our strategy. And so a few years ago, we adopted the UN Global Compact Sustainable Development Goals, and we made a public statement about that as is required, and we've signed up to several other commitments, and also on human rights, on diversity and inclusion. And since then, what we did a year and a half ago when I took over managing that aspect is that we put together a sustainability committee, and that committee oversees the various areas of ESG, and we have C-suite members, department heads, and subject matter specialists covering the environmental, the social, and the governance in various areas of the operations of the business. And that committee is divided into subcommittees for the E, the S, and the G. And last year we published our first ESG report on TCFD standards. So that's more or less been the approach that we've taken. And of course, in our sustainability program, we have all of the obvious elements, such as eliminating single-use plastics, diversity and inclusion in the workforce, good corporate governance.
Excellent. That's an awful lot. You've obviously been thinking about it for quite a few years now as well, by the sound of it. So I've got one for Chris now, really. Chris, do you think it's possible in the context of an HMA to fully align the ESG related interests of all the different layers of parties that you see? So owner, branded operator, lender, white label operator. Do you think it's too ambitious at the moment to expect that the interests of all those different parties can be aligned?
I think it probably is potentially too early, because I don't think all the issues have even been identified yet, still less addressed. So I think we're down to reasonableness in many hotel management agreements, and certainly as far as the S part is concerned, decency, where it's not addressed by law. So I think it does take a lot of goodwill on the part of the various interested parties to come up with something in a management agreement. But increasingly, people are willing to sit down and talk about it in our experience. And I think one of the reasons for that on the ownership side, which is where many of the costs are incurred, of course, is looking forward towards exit. And yes, some of the owners may be, long-term 15, 20, 30-year ownership horizon investors. Others may want to be out in 5 years, and they're looking forward, saying, if I'm fully compliant in 5 years' time, that's going to increase the audience for this potential asset sale. So I think there are lots of overlaying, interrelated aspects of this that need to be considered. But overall, I think I'm seeing, people being reasonable about inclusion of ESG matters in a management agreement.
Thanks, Chris. And perhaps we should mention, before we go on too much longer, obviously we've got the operators' brand standards in the mix here in most cases. And perhaps something that all of you might like to comment on, how do you think it's possible to align brand standards with ESG commitments and increasing requirements that are being imposed by legislation and the regulators, for example?
I can comment on that, because I think over the last 13 years, we've been part of building about 30 hotels across about 5-10 countries so far, and with all brands from, all the big brands are in the room. I think the brand standards we see from the brands are more on the ESG side, is more about, well, let's say E side, is more guidance, and that they don't really hold a gun on your head, which is great. But from a guidance perspective, all of them have been extremely supportive to trying to figure out a way what that hotel looks like at the end that is going to have a longer lifespan and sustainable, right? So, and we've been lucky, using their brand standard, convincing either the developer or our capital partner to say, look, we really need to push BREEAM Excellent or LEED Platinum, whatever it may be in that particular region. We're building a hotel with them to say these are the sort of benefits, long-term benefits. And in certain occasions, actually, brand hasn't been an issue. Actually, brand came to table to help us educate them. So I think from that perspective today, brands are mostly cooperative, but they're also trying to find their way. So we are, I think. So there's a whole collaboration going on at the moment.
Hadrian, would you like to comment on that?
Yeah, well, brand standards evolve. And I think they have to evolve over time, and they'll evolve for ESG purposes as well. I think in the management agreement discussion, we have to take on these comments. I mean, they're long-term agreements, right? 20, 30 years with renewals. They're very high-level agreements, so they don't really go into the granular areas of every area of operation. And the brand standards is often where we see the ESG programs of the hotel brands, because those standards actually evolve more quickly than the standard management agreements themselves. And so we have, in our technical and design guidelines, we have the recommendations for certifications. We have all of the policies and procedures and the training requirements on anti-bribery and corruption and all of those things that go into brand standards, and on the environmental side as well, whether it's the new standards to eliminate the plastics, single-use plastics, or room temperature and those aspects as well. And in fact, it's through the management agreement, not with direct clauses in the management agreement that impose the ESG, but through the right of the operator to manage the business and implement those brand standards that we see the implementation. And I think, as it was noted earlier, it's a 30-year agreement, it's a collaboration.
Definitely. And just to mention that also, we were talking about this in our prep for this session, that our friend, the Uniform System of Accounts, the 12th edition, is due out soon, which we'll all be really delighted to hear, I'm sure. And it won't provide calculations to determine hotels' carbon footprint, but it will provide a general framework, apparently, to measure energy use, water use and waste production, so that hotels can deliver their performance over time. So even good old USALI is catching up here. David, did you want to come in on the brand standards point?
Yeah, not on USALI. I was getting ready for a USALI question, which is difficult. I think actually the point Hadrian just made is really key, and Chris is making as well, and is a partnership. So all of these agreements are actually designed around that. Yep. And that's what you need to have. And it's then, when we look at it as an investor, there's a big requirement coming through from our investors. We've also got a big social kind of requirement as a community to actually make a difference here and do things differently. The brand standards often go back to what guests want. And I think we've all been into pick a hotel. We've all been to a hotel room that feels like it's about -10 when you walk in because the aircon is at full blast. And that goes back a little bit to just sort of, some travelers, and that's what they want. And that, it's not necessarily a brand standard, but it's just more kind of what happens.
Behavior.
Right. And so the partnership piece needs to be as much about things like that. One of the first things we always look at is the building management system. I never thought I'd be saying that on a panel, but that is key in a hotel like this. The building management system will make a massive difference to the performance of the building on all the energy metrics. And it's then how the two parties work together on that, rather than somebody saying, but for the brand we need this. Like, hang on, I think you have to have a priority, right? And I think the classical management agreement or any brand franchise is the same. The brand standards are very high up in the hierarchy. And I think with the ESG debate, we just need to realize that has to come up in a similar place in that hierarchy.
David, you obviously deal with a lot of leases, and I know that your thinking is very far advanced in relation to the types of clauses that you expect and require to see in your leases. I know HMAs are a very different animal, but do you think we can draw any parallels here as to the kind of provisions? And you talked before about how you wash down landlord and tenant commitments down to operators. What do you maybe give a thought to the key ones that you think we might be able to pass on?
In the lease it's more definitive, obviously, because you can say, you will do this, otherwise you're in default on the lease. So you can have.
And with an FRI lease, we are very definitely seeing tenants being required to take on full-on commitments at their cost.
More of our leases are the German DAC and FAC, where we are responsible for the majority of that means you're responsible for most of it. So again, it is a partnership, and it is always a discussion. And when you buy a lease, it may not have the clause in, and then you need to add the requirements to it. But I think you can learn from it. It's just that almost the language will change. You could probably take the same list of items, you just change the language from you will do it, otherwise you're in default on the lease, to you will discuss doing these things on an annual basis, whatever. But I think you can learn a lot from it.
We keep coming back, as you'll see, to the we will discuss, rather than at the moment having anything more prohibitive or...
Correct.
Sorry.
Yeah, I think just one thing very important, nobody is being pushed into any of the lease or HMA without knowing ins and outs of any particular building or the building that is going to be built. So therefore, I think common sense is that, especially if you're doing a development lease, which I have done, and we have few of them, is that you sit around with the landlord, developer, and the tenant. So, okay, we want to reach to this BREEAM excellent or whatever level we want to do it. We want to have BREEAM in operation when the hotel opens. So let's draw this, how it's going to look like. And then you're looking at your market and you know your business case for that particular hotel and you know how much you can pay. So you come, everyone takes a bit of a hit. So there is not just a landlord, but there's a developer. And if it's an existing building you're taking over, then you know all the usages, you know all the issues. So you talk around it. It's not just putting one cost to just the operator or just the owner. I think everybody's just now talking around this and finding an amicable solution.
And I think it's a different situation, obviously, when you're dealing with a new build, where you can put in lots of provisions as to the standards that the hotel will have to achieve, than when you'll say retrofitting or refurbishment an old house, say in Chelsea, Chris, which is something that we're involved in. I mean, it's a totally different picture. Ashley, while you're speaking, I'd like to raise something with you, which is something you've already touched on. And I know you feel strongly about the need for owners and operators to take more notice of that elusive S in ESG. Can you maybe give us a bit more about what you've been doing on that side of
Sure.
things?
Actually, the right person who should be talking about this is Janet, who's sitting with me, joined. She's our Chief People Officer, and we've been together growing Cycas for the last 13, 14 years. But I think as a manager, the only asset we have is the people, right? So that's just start with that. So it's not me or Janet who's cleaning or running the hotels, it's those people. So for us, the people comes first. I know everybody says that, but how much effort you put behind this is the real, importance about, again, it's the diversity, there's inclusion, is the fair wages, equal wages, it goes across, and if you imagine that we have hotels we're managing in Budapest to Prague to Barcelona to Dundee, with the jurisdictions we deal with, the type of cultures we deal with and everything, and if we can't get that right, it just becomes, it will affect, in fact, the whole company. So we really sort of, as the ExCom, and we all responsible of the ESG, and in every sort of ExCom meeting, monthly or bi-monthly, this is a subject we focus on, and especially every 3 months, we have a whole day session around people that Janet leads, and it's all about this. It's all about where we stand for our team members, what are we doing it and in different jurisdictions, and what can we do better for them, and that's really important for us.
That's great. And I think, Ufi, do we have time for one more question? One more before then we can maybe take some from the floor. If you could keep an eye on the clock for us, that would be great. So finally, can each of you please give me your key tip for the best way in which owners, operators and other stakeholders can collaborate to make a real difference in this area? Chris, what's your key tip for us?
Oh gosh, it's probably forgetting that old adage of when you've finalised and signed a management agreement, you put it in a drawer and you
Put it
never
on the
look at
shelf
it again.
and never have to look at it again.
It's the most stupid thing that was ever said about hotel management agreements. I mean, I've said it. I'm sure some of you guys have.
Especially not the ones you and I have signed, Chris.
But honestly, it increasingly they're sort of living, breathing documents that do need to be referred to and that may need to be modified, as we've discussed every year with the budget process. So that strict, sort of this is the management agreement, read it and weep was one of the expressions that used to be bandied about in my day. Thing of the past.
David.
I think about partnership in terms of how everybody works together. And then the tip on the building is the building management system. I said that before.
So partnership, collaboration.
Yeah, it has to be, otherwise it won't work.
I remember being at the Berlin Hotel Conference many years ago, and there was a lot of talk about when you're negotiating a management contract, it's very much like the courtship for a relationship. And if it's all going badly wrong, then the marriage isn't going to be a great success. So that's an end maybe to confrontational negotiations. Ashley, what would you like to add to that?
No, I completely agree. If you don't feel like it's going to be a partnership, it's never going to work. And I think one of the things, again, for us, we're not a listed company and we're not an institutional investor, so therefore, or an institutional company, we actually look at our partners and see if our values match. If it doesn't, we don't
be a
progress.
disaster,
It's just we don't need to. So that's an important one for
I think
us.
that's really important, isn't it? Especially in the context of this topic today. I think that will become increasingly important. Hadrian.
Well, I fully agree with all of these comments, and also just to add to the partnership concept that it's also not a competition. We're all need to work together towards a common good, and whether that's imposing obligations in management agreements or investing in some infrastructure at the hotel to enable the brand standards to evolve, to improve the efficiency of the hotel. I think the overriding principle is that we have to remember is that concept.
And improve the guest experience overall, yes.
That was great. Karen, I think, sorry to be the Irish shepherd again, I think we're out of time, but we'll try and do is carve some time at the very end for questions, and hopefully some of you will still be here. David, I know you've got to go. But thank you all very much.
Thank you for your attention,
Thank you.
and thanks to
That
the
was
panellists.
terrific.